the most difficult aspect of recovery is manpower. People are willing to give to GoFundMes. Grants are out there when you apply for it and you make your case. But the manpower, especially for the African American Museum, being an all-volunteer institution, it's taken us this long to get to a point where we can start cleaning the collection. And even then, I don't know how fast that procedure is going to go because it's going to rely on volunteer labor.
Knowing that the flood was coming, that the water was going to get in the museum, he and a lot of the local people, fire departments, came down and removed the bottom 2 drawers of those filing cabinets that was chock full of genealogical family material, old photographs. Just opened up the files and peeled them off one by one, hung them on a clothesline to dry, spread them out on every surface we could find to spread them out on, and turned them. It's kind of like curing hay or anything else. And they did dry. I did not know that maybe what we should have done with their documents was immediately take them and put them in a freezer. That way we weren't so pressed with time to try to get them separated.
I saw instruments, which I retrieved a few. We were the first to cross the bridge back into the factory complex, which had also filled up with water like a giant basin. And, it had destroyed everything we had built. It had destroyed all the machinery that we had leased over there.
For cleanup, I didn't know what we would do if we had to get, just overwhelmed. Like, what would we do with that? We're in a temporary location about probably 3 or 4 miles from where we were.
It's a challenge because we still haven't been able to really put a number on what the total recovery costs are. When you consider what we lost in the archive, we're considering our building. It's situated closely to the river. How do we move forward from that?
How do you get back to business after you've experienced a natural disaster and you're on the road to recovery? After today's session, we think you'll be a step closer to knowing exactly where to begin. I'm Bill Goodman, Executive Director of Kentucky Humanities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Disaster Preparedness online series. We're pleased you've taken the time to join us for this important program, focusing on disaster recovery and the basic needs to consider as you develop an emergency preparedness plan. This series is made possible with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our thanks as well to our many partners, including Performing Arts Readiness, the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation, the Kentucky Historical Society, Kentucky Arts Council, the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, and finally, to the men and women who have shared their remarkable real-life stories. We appreciate how your experiences will help others to learn about the importance of disaster preparedness. Now, I'll turn it over to our instructors for this session, Elaina Gregg, Tom Clareson, and Jan Newcomb.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad that you could join us today for the third of our 4 sessions. I'm Tom Clareson, Project Director of Performing Arts Readiness, and I'm calling in from Central Ohio. Jan?
Hi, I'm Jan Newcomb. I'm Executive Director of the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. And I also work with Tom on the Performing Arts Readiness as Performing Arts Coordinator. And I'm calling in from Columbia, South Carolina.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Elaina Gregg, the Emergency Programs Manager for the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation, and I am calling in from Washington, D.C.
Okay, and to start on our next slide, after our sessions on disaster preparedness and response, our focus today is on disaster recovery. getting back in business after an emergency or a disaster. And if we could go to the next slide, I actually want to start off on what we've been calling a homework review. We'll have a lot of activity today. We're going to have you answer some questions in chat, starting pretty quickly here. And then we'll do a few polls during the session today. And as always, if you have questions during the session, please put those in the Q&A section, and we will answer those as soon as we can. So before we launch into our topic, I wanted to ask 2 questions to follow up on our previous classes. We talked in an earlier session about how many of your organizations have a written disaster plan. And in chat, if you could indicate if you do have a written plan and list your organization's name, that would be great. And we can see organizations who do have that. So we got people are working on them. So that's excellent. Thank you. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to give you a lot of information to be able to develop one of these plans. And certainly you can continue to be in contact with us after this series of sessions is over. And we can review any plans you have in progress, that type of thing. This is great. A lot of people working on plans. And then I like to see the Russell County Public Library, the idea that you're updating is really good. You can't just have it on the shelf forever because staff will change and your building will change, all of those things. So good. Okay. The other thing, our other question was at the last session, we talked about being able to locate important insurance information. And if you could indicate in chat if you've found and reviewed your insurance plan, and again, list your organization's name, that would be great. So we're going to focus now on the look at insurance, because we decided and talked about that being a pretty important thing for us to look at. So any comments on insurance would be greatly appreciated. Great, Jody, thank you. And Cody. Good. So we have a number of folks who do have them. About half of the folks that are answering today have the insurance. So I really appreciate you looking for that. Excellent. Keep any answers or questions you have related to that coming. The building supervisor has it. That's always a good thing to know. Yeah, on this slide that we've got in front of us, you may recognize this from one of our previous sessions, because I think this is such an important area to look at. Here are some questions about insurance, and I think about this when you have that plan in your hands, when you do find it or when you're reviewing it. What type of insurance do you have, and what does it cover? Do you have specialized policies? And this can be for arts organizations, cultural organizations. Event cancellation is very important. Something that I call museum piece insurance, and that might be if you're a library and you have some things in special collections that are definitely unique to your organization, you can talk to your insurance agent and say, you know, we have our general insurance, but we might want to have a little bit more on some of these other areas. And then business interruption insurance. And we're going to talk a lot about those hiccups that happen when there are business interruptions during the presentation today. So you need to rely on your insurance first, or bring in your insurance first, before working with your county, state, and federal emergency management agencies for funding. They always say to work with your insurance first and then be working with potentially with FEMA. And what we always need to do is ask your insurance folks what documentation is needed for a claim. Some make it simple and some certainly do not. So we're going to talk a little bit more about insurance a little bit later in our session today. Now, I'm going to turn things over to Elaina at this point to talk about disaster recovery vendors.
Yes, hello everybody. So the next few slides will be a continuation on a topic we touched on during the last webinar, working with disaster recovery vendors. We thought it would be helpful to give you all a roadmap of sorts for approaching disaster recovery vendors and just different questions that you can ask. The steps outlined here are taken from a tip sheet created by the National Heritage Responders. You can see this tip sheet working with disaster recovery vendors, as well as others that they create on different topics at culturalheritage.org/NHR. So when considering disaster recovery vendors, first you want to ask lots of questions. Some examples are listed here, such as how long has the vendor been in business? Which drying techniques do they use? How do they treat for mold, bacteria, viruses, parasites? Can the work be done in place, or do the materials need to be taken off-site? And just as a reminder, you will all be receiving these slides after the end of this series, so no need to furiously write down all of the information on this slide. I know that there's quite a bit. Next slide, please. And then some other questions. Who will be your point of contact? So it's important to have somebody's information that you can be in touch with throughout the recovery process. References are very helpful. What security measures do they use? Do they use third-party vendors? And then what type of staff are they employing? Do they have temporary or permanent staff? Can you expect that your collections will be worked on by the same people, or will there be rotating people in and out? So by asking questions, you get a baseline of what to expect from different vendors, and that can help inform your decision. So the second step is going to be asking for written documentation outlining the methods and practices that the vendor will employ. This is referred to as the scope of work or project plan, and it's really helpful to have this written down, both to reference for your insurance company and to, check back and see what was completed and what maybe left a gap after the fact. Insurance. So kind of piggybacking off of what Tom mentioned, it's really important to check with your insurance provider on what is covered. So sometimes insurance companies will make you use the vendor that their vendor for recovery. Or there will be different stipulations, such as anything that's taken off-site might not be covered by insurance. So understanding what insurance is going to cover can then help inform questions to ask the different vendors. And that honestly might narrow down your decision. So very important to get in touch with insurance before you go through the vendor process. And then, of course, contractual agreement. Okay, so moving into long-term recovery. First, we are curious to hear from you all. If you could use the chat and put in your first thoughts when you think of long-term recovery, I will read them out for those of you who are watching the recording or streaming into Facebook Live. I will get us kicked off. So when I think of long-term recovery, I think of continuity of operations planning. I think of funding long-term, how we're going to source funding, how we're going to pay for different things. Anybody else? How to keep operating? Yep. Restoring operations to pre-disaster environment? Absolutely. How to build or change policies that will prevent troubles in recovery next time? Yes. Prevention? Absolutely. Funding, safety and needs of staff. How long until back in operation? Yes. Awesome. Thank you all. And then similarly, what types of actions typically take place during the recovery phase of a disaster? You can also write these answers into the chat. I'll start by saying talking to different contractors. So getting different contracts in place. Yep. Okay. We have some people entering in the chat. Safety, assessing damage, cleaning. Yes. Lots of cleaning. All right. Great. And then how long do you all think that the recovery process may take? Rebuilding, yes, years. So some of you have said years, some months, some weeks, depends on the severity. Someone wrote that it took them nearly 2 years to get FEMA reimbursement. Yeah, so the answer to this one is truly it depends. There's no perfect formula for how long the recovery process is going to take. I know several institutions are 10 years into recovery from storms that happened in 2013. So it definitely depends on how your site is impacted. And that's important to remember when going through the planning process for recovery. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you all for your engagement. Okay, so thinking about long-term recovery, these are just a few key things that mostly have been mentioned in the chat, but some things to think about when you are creating your plan. You want to consider additional staff time. So staff is going to be needed more than usual for ongoing assessment, treatment, repairs, replacement of institutional holdings if needed. Continual assessments of both the collections and priority needs. So this is going to take place on an ongoing basis for what could be up to years. Negotiating new or existing contractual agreements. So this is going to be with anyone from contractors to consultants, disaster recovery companies, insurance policies, FEMA. Lots of contracts can come into play in the recovery process. And with all that said, funding is super important. So planning to be able to pay for additional staff time, storage, outside workspaces, to pay for building repairs and collections needs. There may be reimbursements available, but typically you have to front the money on, after disaster on the front end. So having that money available is really important. And I know very difficult, but it is, if possible, it is really helpful to have some sort of emergency fund in place for recovery. And then damaged collections may require isolated storage. So this could mean using neighboring facilities. So identifying different spaces outside of your discrete site could be helpful for putting collections that have been impacted. And then I think at this point in our disaster series, we all know how important preparedness is. I remember when I first learned this figure, it was for every $1 you spend in preparedness, you save $6 in recovery. I think now it's for every $1 you save $11 in recovery. So the point remains that by investing on the front end, you definitely save money on the back end. That is really difficult. And especially when there's been gaps between disasters, it's hard to make the case for fundraising for an emergency event. But if you can do it, it's going to save boatloads of money on the back end. So different activities that you all can do before the recovery process in the planning phase is doing assessments of your institution, putting in protective measures for both the building and collections, and then training. So making sure that staff knows how to respond to different events and how to make a response as effective as possible, which again are all topics that we've reviewed in the past few webinars. And then including recovery in your disaster plan. I know several of you wrote in that you are in the process of creating your plan now. Thinking about recovery is going to create a holistic view at the disaster as you make your plan. So identifying resources such as different vendors that are available to you, including insight that you've gleaned from your insurance policy and different services that you can use now before the recovery process kicks in is going to be helpful. It's going to save you time and the mental strain of going through this process after something has occurred. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Jan.
Thanks, Elaina. I just want to, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences as CEO of 10 different arts organizations over my 40-year career. And it's really to point out and have you all remember that crises and potential disasters come in many different packages and sizes. When I first became a CEO of an arts organization, I was 29, and I immediately had to deal with a continuity of business dilemma. It was a huge dilemma. And Tom is going to address the importance of having a business continuity plan after me. But so I'm just going through, I was asked to do my top 10 experiences. And I have 8 categories because 2 of them happened twice in 2 different states and different organizations. First one is stalker, having a stalker or a hostile intruder. And this is one of the ones that happened to me twice. One time I had students in teaching a dance class, and a intruder came through to the dance studio. And what I had to do is get my dance class out. Fortunately, there was an egress. We had 2nd floor steps going down, and this was before cell phones. So it was a scary situation, and having that egress was really important. Second time it happened in South Carolina was a little scarier because my office there was no egress. It was like a closet in a performing arts center, and I was really the only one there. And fortunately, both occasions had happy endings, although we did find that the stalker in South Carolina was wanted for murder in Texas. So I feel fortunate that I was able to get out of that situation. The next one was regional flooding due to a hurricane. And this had devastating loss of life and property. And of course, we have been dealing with a lot of terrible flooding and mudslides, and of course the wildfires. I
think we may have lost Jan for a second there, so I can definitely step in here. With the regional flooding due to the hurricanes, we have been seeing that type of situation in a number of cases, and we want everyone to be on the lookout for the storms that are coming at the end of this month, beginning of next month. We have a number of people in Florida and as well as in Georgia that we're already working with. So that is important to look at. On our next area, loss of major donors of a series. Jan is going to talk a little bit about the importance of reserve funds because she has experienced a couple of times where major donors of an arts series were lost due to concerns in their businesses, changes at the top of their businesses. So looking at the idea of what is your backup plan? Do you have a sort of a plan B or a list B for some of the donors that you could work with? And Jan was able to do that a couple of different times, although the programs had already been printed up. And I think that that was definitely a concern. On our fourth situation, a roof collapse after excessive rain. This is one of the first stories I heard from Jan when she joined Performing Arts Readiness. And she said that she was at a organization that had a large building, a large roof, and it was the end of her first day at work. And one of the local fire officials came in and they said, "Lady, there's a whole bunch of ducks on your roof." And she was wondering what was going on. And what ended up happening was she had sort of a lake on the roof because a lot of water had collected there. And so they ended up getting the roof drained out, but the library, the music library at this organization was in jeopardy. And it was right over the music library where the main amount of water was. So thinking about roof maintenance and roof replacement, something that is definitely not a situation that a lot of us expect, but maybe looking at how old your roof is and thinking about what you needed to do in case that happens would be helpful. The other thing was that she said that the landlord at this building had not worked on doing a whole lot of upkeep, so that was a problem there. A surprise 8-inch snowstorm. What she had to think about there was, what kind of cost would there be for canceling a concert? For you at libraries, archives, and museums, what would that do to your gate count? What would that do if you charge admission to your admission counts and your admission revenue? So think about what the cost of cancellation might be if you have to because of some type of a storm. And then I will hand things back over to Jan and for point 6.
I am sorry about that, but you did see the car crashing into the result of the car crashing into my office on an earlier slide that Tom talked about, and that was really a scary situation. Could have been fatal, except I was standing on the other side of the room. And but we had no access to office and files, and it was right before a performance. And so I played a cat and mouse game with the codes officer because the building built in 1875, and they were worried about, obviously things falling down on us. But that really gave me an idea. We really need to know what we do if we can't be in our own venue. Then there was the bomb threat during a performance, and it was a brand new performing arts center, and we did not have an evacuation training program. We had no plan. Fortunately, the ED was there at the time because everybody looked to her for her guidance on this, and when really it should have been probably the designated chain of command should have been the stage manager. All went well, and there was no bomb, but it was really obvious that there needed to be a plan. Now, the clocked furnace is probably the most upsetting of all, in that we were renting an office from an architect who said, "Oh, I went through all the furnace and everything's fine." Well, it wasn't fine, and somebody, one of my staff members, actually had a car accident, and she went off the road, and they happened to take blood sample, and they said carbon monoxide poisoning, and we had to close the office for more than a week, and again had to deal with a codes officer. But I want to tell you, get the right people who know what they're doing when you're having inspections and safety inspections. It wasn't enough to have the landlord help us on that. Okay, so the lessons I've learned, and thank you, Tom, for helping me through the South Carolina weather here has caused some Wi-Fi issues. So with all those things that happen, I learned about, as I just said, get help assessing security and also hazards within the workplace, top and the bottom bullets. And with a stalker, know your state law, know what you have to do and how you can protect yourself from hostile intruders. And also the other things with the roof collapse, etc., know what to do and how to evacuate, and know your vendors and insurance policies. With the roof collapsing, I found out very quickly, it was my first day as CEO of Rochester Philharmonic, that we were in charge of all, even though we rented the space, we were in charge of all capital improvements. So I had to immediately get donors to help us with that. And the two bullets in red, I'm going to talk about later today, but very important to understand the financial damage of things and how you can mitigate, and also a crisis communication plan and who you need to communicate with is important. And for Rochester, know your lease liabilities and have a collections plan. For the orchestra, publish a ticket refund policy. We had no policy. We could have actually gone bankrupt. And designate an alternative workplace, which was what I should have had in place before the car crashing, and backing up files. I think everybody knows about those things, but in an accessible offsite location. And if you have a specific software that you use, make sure you have access to that software. If you're ticket donor based e-tapestries, say, make sure you can access it, because just having a computer in another place may not give you the information you need. And of course, the evacuation plan and training staff and volunteers, very important to have a volunteer training thing. We did that at the Philharmonic to make sure all our docents and people who were helping patrons really knew how to go through the space and make sure everybody was evacuated. And then, as I've mentioned before, designating chains of command for different crises. And it's not always the CEO. And not only chains of command designated, make sure others know. So if I say, oh, it's during a performance, then it's going to be Molly, who's the stage manager, who is going to be the decision maker. I will take my orders from her on that. And then, of course, schedule regular inspections to uncover hazardous workplace conditions. And that is very important for any, if you're renting, if you own, very important for safety. And now I will hand it over to Tom.
Okay, great.
Again.
Well, I know this group is likes to do these polls, and we learn an awful lot when we find out what your answers are here. So we wanted to see if your organizations have business continuity or business resumption plans. This may be a separate plan, separate from your disaster plan, or it really should be part of your disaster plan. So if you can vote yes, no, or don't know, that would be great. And we will see what the votes say in just a minute. And I'll be interested in seeing these results for sure. Okay, so 19%, 5 of the people here have one, 38% do not, and 42% don't know. And that is something that we oftentimes hear, that people don't know if they have this type of plan. This is really important because in a lot of cases, this goes beyond your collections. It goes beyond that type of thing at your organizations, and it looks at processes. It looks at, as it says, the business continuity, the actual way to continue to do your business. So why should arts organizations, why should cultural organizations have developed proactive approaches for implementing continuity of business operations as part of your all hazards plan, which Jan talked about when we were doing our very first class? This whole idea, why is there a need for business continuity planning? Well, I think it helps to protect an organization regardless of what disaster may occur. And that's really important in today's really increasingly unpredictable world, whether it's an unscheduled technology downtime, which we see regularly, a supply chain disruption, which is something I had never heard of before 2020, whether it's a man-made event or any of those types of situations, a natural disaster as well. Organizations of all sizes recognize that they need to be ready for just about anything now. And when business is disrupted, it can cost money. You can have lost revenues. You can have lower gate counts. You may have extra expenses due to concerns with having to do cleanup from some type of a disaster. And that means reduced budgets. Insurance doesn't always cover all costs and probably oftentimes cannot offset the loss of your patrons, of your donors, your sponsors, people who are utilizing your facilities. let's take a look in the Q&A here. Is there a template available anywhere for a business resumption plan? In the next couple of slides, you will see some really great examples and really great things that you can use to start your plan. So we will have that, and I can also make a note about business resumption plan templates or samples, and we will get those in time for our next class, which is going to be on resilience and resources. So thank you for that question. So I think it's really important that we have these types of plans because as Jan has been saying, anything can happen. And in our next slide, really, if you don't think it can happen, consider these scenarios. Consider Jan's scenarios, but consider these scenarios. And as I said, these go sometimes beyond your collections. These are not your garden variety disasters, but many of you might have experienced this type of thing. Your website goes down and orders are lost. Your library, archives, museum patrons lose access to services on your site. How long can you afford to stay down? Usually the answer is not very long, but we want to build our plan to deal with this. Days of heavy rain and severe flooding wash out roads. Staff and patrons can't access your venue. How will this affect your business? Well, certainly we had situations with this going on that we've heard about from the speakers at the beginning of each of our sessions, that we heard about in Jan's and Caper calls with people across the state of Kentucky who were involved in both the tornadoes and flooding situations. So we need to think about what would happen here and how can we resume some semblance of business even if this type of thing happens. Technology, again, a hacker gets into your system, hijacks your patron or donor database and steals the identities. How will you repair the damage? Right before COVID, I was at a session in New Jersey where 3 small organizations, 2 theaters and 1 museum, had a hacker get into the system and really cause a lot of trouble. And it is something now that we have people focus on. It's something that is such a focus that actually Performing Arts Readiness runs a class on cybersecurity. A powerful earthquake strikes in the middle of the day. There's structural damage to your facility and some employees are unaccounted for. What actions will you take? Well, 2 things I wanted to mention about this. First is that I was up in Cleveland on Thursday and Friday last week, and Thursday they had an unbelievable rainstorm and tornadoes, which has not usually happened in the city there, so that was strange. And then the next day in the counties east of Cleveland, there was an earthquake. And it was actually something in Northeast Ohio that very rarely happens. So it was something that people up there have now said, oh, we're going to have to add this to our disaster plan. What do we do in case this type of thing happens? And you want to be able to account for your employees, whether they're supposed to be on site or whether they are in, whether they're at home during the day. And finally, another situation, back to the earthquake for just a minute. I think we should think about this in Kentucky, particularly in Western Kentucky, because of your proximity to the New Madrid Fault. So this is something that could affect you, even though you're like, oh, earthquakes, those are mainly in California. Well, it's not true. There have been some in DC, there have been Ohio. We have seen them in a number of places in the West. So think about that as you're developing your plan. Business located on the same street as a courthouse, controversial cases being tried, with street protests outside of your building. How are you going to safeguard your staff and maintain operations? This, again, is another kind of scenario that is quite plausible. So planning is the answer to these questions and the question, what if? And it can easily spell the difference between continued operation or permanent shutdown of your organization if a disaster should occur. Are there other examples? And this might be, yes, something to think about. Jan threw in an idea here. The fault between Boston to Charleston is being watched constantly, but I wanted to ask, are there other examples that you all have seen with the risks and hazards in your areas that you might want to add to chat? So feel free to add any questions you might have in chat, or any other situations you might see in chat that really could cause a hiccup in business continuity. I think that would be really helpful to see. And meanwhile, I'm going to wait just a moment or two to see what people have as answers in that area. Any other types of risks, hazards, situations that were business interrupters. And I want to go to the Q&A for a second. Oh, okay. That question is done. So we have no open questions. Okay. So think about anything else that might have disrupted your business continuity. And I'm going to move on to actually talk about some of the planning situations that are needed. So we have a couple of things that I want to mention. Business continuity planning means working to decrease the likelihood of a disruptive incident and preparing your organization to continue delivery of its most essential products and services if a disruption is going to occur. It's really an essential part of your organization's all hazards preparedness projects. So we're going to talk mainly about business continuity planning, or as Elaina called it earlier, continuity of operations planning. It goes by a variety of names, but this highlights the vulnerabilities that might cause losses to your organization and plans for continued operations. So this is sort of, keeping the pulse of your operations going. I also want you to consider succession planning as a process for how the organization determines interim leadership and identifies new leaders who can replace current leaders if they leave, retire, or become even temporarily incapacitated. So these are two things that I wanted to define, and I want you to consider as you're developing your all hazards plan. Next slide. When we're doing our business continuity plan, if you have a plan, it dictates how to take action, and that outcome, taking action, could be the survival of the organization by maintaining services to stakeholders, protecting employees, protecting assets, and minimizing financial losses. So the steps in what we're doing here really include impact analysis, which we're going to talk about next, recovery strategies, and we'll talk about a couple of those, but there are a lot that are available. Plan development and testing, maintenance, and practice of the plan. So for my slides, this is probably the most important thing, and we'll stay on this slide for a moment or two. A business impact analysis is really an important activity, and this is similar to a risk analysis that you might do about your building and your geographic location, but this is helping you to understand the impact that disruptions would have on your business, such as which processes would be disrupted, how severe the impact would be, and how long your business could survive without those processes running. When an event does happen, and this is from experience, you'll have little time or no time to assess which affected business processes are most vital at that point. It really is important to think about this before a disaster happens, because you'll need to make crucial decisions quickly to divert the resources to maintain your operations while recovering disrupted processes. And if you don't have a business impact analysis and a business continuity plan in place, you'll have to guess what to do in those first few critical moments and hope that you've made the right decision. Making the wrong decision, there could be a chain of disastrous results, from organizational failure to, unfortunately, lawsuits, prosecution, and even loss of life. And we've had a number of organizations, companies, business organizations, talk about how important this is to have, particularly in a production environment, but in an environment as well where it's mainly a people-oriented business. I want to say preparing a BIA as part of your business continuity plan guides you in prioritizing processes and the resources they depend on, and it takes the guesswork out of making decisions in a crisis situation. So We've talked about this a little bit before, but picking a team to help you with this analysis is important. When we're talking about disaster planning, we really want you to think about not being a lone wolf disaster planner. So get a team together and set your scope and objectives. How wide is this type of work going to go? And then gathering information. This is the extremely important part. Identifying the top risks to your business, focusing on the critical operations, and my next slide will really focus on that quite a bit. Understanding the processes that happen at your work, and documenting potential impact with data and staff interviews. And that's the next step, making recommendations and writing a report after you document your findings, presenting the findings to leadership. And some of them may shock people to see all the systems we need to keep going. And then the next steps are identify any gaps, make a plan to address those, and review your business impact analysis at least annually. So on the next slide, this really leads into some of the functions that you can break things down into 3 different categories. Mission critical are functions that really must always remain operational if at all possible. Immediate services, those need to be restored in less than 12 hours. And normal operations, they probably don't need to be restored until after the incident. But what I want you to think about here is the kind of situations we might come across. These might include prioritization of people functions, the roles of volunteers, staff, board, and vendors. What is the situation about your facilities, the business or event area? Your finances and insurance, where are those functions in the level of importance? Your exhibits, are those something that are part of normal operations, or are they important enough they're immediate services to be restored? And your programs, how quickly do you need to get those back going? So this is really another key important aspect when you're thinking about the sort of business response and business resumption type of activities. So next slide, one of the tools that I would suggest that you look at, and this is from the FEMA Emergency Management Guide for Business and Industry, and it's called a Hazard Vulnerability Analysis Chart. And this is something that you can get from the FEMA website, but this is really an interesting thing. You are able to determine your vulnerabilities to various emergency events. What's the probability of snow and ice or workplace violence? What is the human impact, high to low, the property impact, and the business impact for you to be able to keep doing your business? Can this be taken care of by internal resources, or do we need external resources? And again, I would say if you can go with the scale of 1 to 5, sort of high to low, impact, probability, and weakness of resources, what you want to do is the lower the score, the better. Higher scores indicate a need for contingency plans. So think about this. And, is this something that you could utilize at your organization? And take a look at FEMA's website under the Hazard Vulnerability Analysis Chart. Okay. 2 last things on my portion of the discussion here. I wanted to talk about 2 potential recovery strategies. You saw that as part of the sort of wheel of business continuity. And the first is alternate locations. This is really interesting. Both Elaina and Jan mentioned alternative locations. What to do if you're not able to get in your own venue. And it's working to secure temporary spaces that have been previously identified. For arts organizations, the 4 types of spaces are theaters for performances, your offices, and then production and rehearsal spaces. For cultural heritage institutions, they can include collections storage, collections processing, public use spaces, and staff offices. Now, You're all aware that library and archives buildings are very complex structures. I can simplify this a bit. I always say that the front of the building serves as the public areas, while the back is a factory for storing, processing, cataloging, repairing, and dealing with the materials that you're going to have. Those are things to consider. You need a plan in place for alternate locations if the disaster affects a community or a region. Typically, and this is something that Elaina talked about before, get that idea of a memorandum of understanding and have that to be used to secure alternate locations in the event of damage or inaccessibility to your venue. I always tell a story about the University of Houston during the tropical storm Allison in 2001 and during Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Somehow or other, the University of Houston was able to always have places for other organizations to perform, to have public programs. And we always said that the president of the university must have had a hotline, a red telephone on her desk, because people were calling her all the time to get spaces. And we also have made the comment that every place from the cafeteria to possibly a large coat closet in their student union was used at one time or another because they had those alternate locations. So very important activity. The other recovery strategy is in our next slide, and that is insurance. We're coming back to this. I had mentioned we would revisit insurance, and really what I wanted to say here is the lack of proper insurance can be financially devastating. Most organizations only discover that their insurance coverage is inadequate after a disaster. Now, insurance companies oftentimes bundle packages such as business liability or commercial umbrella insurance for businesses and organizations that want a clear and easy choice. But I think every organization is unique. So individualizing a plan with a clear understanding of what needs to be insured and what doesn't is good business continuity planning. At a minimum, these types of insurance that your organization could look at, some are art specific, but most are very general. Look for an insurance broker that's familiar with the cultural community, so you'll have the proper coverage against all types of losses. Take this slide. Once we are able to send the slides to you, take this slide to your insurance company and say, hey, are we covered? How can we get covered for these if we feel that there are areas that you need to deal with? And having a business continuity plan could help your organization improve your insurance costs and coverage. So I wanted to mention that as well. So take a look at all of these. How many of these could apply to your business? Again, this is another one of those important recovery resources when we think about the type of disasters that might happen. On our next slide, I want to ask something that's going to foreshadow a little bit our next class as well. Has your organization ever had a meeting to talk about disaster concerns? And this could be the idea of a staff meeting or a staff and board type of meeting. So if you'll vote yes or no on this, that will be important to gauge as we're moving into our next discussion. So, good. We had 72% yes on having a meeting about disaster concerns, 28% no. I think that we can, when we move to Jan for some more important points, she's going to talk about why this type of thing is important to try to do, and maybe to try to do on a fairly regular basis.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, indeed. Pre-crisis planning is really a wonderful tool to have if you're going through a crisis and you want to get back into business. And I felt that this quote from a professor at Dartmouth, who is the professor of corporate communications, talks about making sure that you develop an integrated strategic approach to communications to be successful. And we have talked about this in other presentations about creating a culture of preparedness within all levels of your organization is really, really an important thing to do, because everybody then understands, from janitor to CEO, the importance of and everybody's involvement in being prepared and being able to communicate what an organization needs to do to get out of a crisis. So on the next slide, having a crisis communication plan is very important, and it needs to have these, it needs to look like having these sections. It comes out of staff discussion and debriefings after you've had crises, and it rolls itself into a plan, but it needs to have these verbs, as I think of it. Managing relevant issues to prevent a crisis. So you really know what you need to be able to be concerned about, so that if something does come up, you're ready for it. And preparing the right people to handle the crisis. This, as I mentioned before, the staff, all staff needs to know, and volunteer, which includes your board, needs to know who speaks for the organization when something happens. And you need to train both staff and volunteer leadership how to convey this sort of information. I know in one place of business, all incoming board chairs had to have a media actual mentoring session with local media, who would say, well, this is the type of thing we'd be asking you, what is your response, and having rehearsal camera for not just leadership of staff, but also the incoming volunteer staff or volunteer in the organization. Speed is very important. If you know what you're doing, and if you're nimble, if you've really trained everybody to be nimble, you're going to be back in business sooner rather than later. And you want to reduce uncertainty. So you think through situations. What happens if, as Tom was talking earlier in these slides, what happens if an earthquake? I mean, you can make this part of your tabletop exercises that Elaina has brought us through, but also even just in staff meetings, just throw it out as part of the agenda. What would you do? What would be the first thing you would do? And incorporate those responses, because sometimes you're going to get some good, important information. And of course, you always want to minimize your liabilities. And that is everything from in every function of your organization. And protecting the organization's reputation is also an important thing. I didn't get to say this, but before, when we lost important donors at two organizations, I had to be very careful in what I said to the public and to explain a situation when a very large employer in the area just pulled out at the last minute. And you don't want to disparage anyone, but you also want to explain to people. So you really have to have these messages kind of at the ready. And then all this does is allow your organization to move forward. And that's what you should be thinking of and remember, your internal communication is very, very important, almost more important than the responses to the public. Because if you're not all in sync as a staff and as a board, it's going to wreak havoc as you begin to open up again. And on my next slide, building a reserve fund and having policies. I think this is the most important thing I learned after running organizations, that you're always going to have these broken roofs or things like that, or the loss of a donor. An operating reserve is an unrestricted fund balance set aside to stabilize a nonprofit's finances by providing a cushion against unexpected events, losses of income, and large unbudgeted expenses. And one thing I did at a local arts agency, I vowed to raise money for a reserve fund so that the organization could run for 1 year. The operations could run, not the re-granting, but the operations. And that fund, I think we're still the only arts council in New York State that has a reserve fund, and it has been used from time to time, but always replenished. And the other thing is, make sure if you have a fund, you have the policies. So as personnel changes in the organization, in both board and staff, you have a trail of and an expectation and a knowledge among people that when this can be used and when it can't be used, who's the one authorizes it. This is something that doesn't have to be very elaborate, but it has to be spelled out, because what you don't want to do, and this is what I know a lot of people do with endowment, they build they pull 3% out and they put that in their budget, so as income, and maybe for the purpose of, a reserve fund you wouldn't have in the budget at all, but maybe trying to train yourself as an organization to perhaps put that 3% into a reserve fund, so that it's not used as a regular income item on your yearly budget. I find that has become what most organizations do, and it's a problem when you lose that income, or you just don't have that percentage that you use. So think of those things in terms of how you might change things around in your own organization. And we were very successful in raising, I think we raised $500,000 just for a reserve fund, and it's been there 25 years. So important things to consider. So on our next slide, we have homework. And really this is about finding out if your organization is involved in any collaborative disaster preparedness and recovery groups or networks. It's important, whether it's cultural network or emergency preparedness network, that your organization knows what it could be participating in and perhaps becomes part of a network and recovery group. What happened when I lost the car crash, car came into the office, we had actually then after that decided how amongst the cultural organizations who could help. Do you have an extra performance space? Do you have access to eTapestry, the software that I could then get my information from? This is all very important, and it can be, and Elaina talked about her networks as well. So find out if your organization is part of one, find out if there is a network in your community. And then also, would you like to participate in that disaster network, and how would you go about doing that? So that's your homework. Don't let your dog eat it, and ask your other staff members what they may think and know about it. And I want to mention the fact that our last and number 4 webinar is going to be on September 12th, same time. And we'd like you to consider questions from everything. We have some reserve funds, local elected officials. Okay, I missed that. But think about all these things. I know they frown on it because sometimes about reserve funds, because they think, well, you're a nonprofit, you shouldn't have a profit, which is not what nonprofit is about. Nonprofit is about, your mission isn't to make money necessarily to pay your shareholders. Your mission is to do what it is that you're, whether it's serving artists or arts groups. And so you say you want to run it like any other business. You want to have reserves. And I think informing elected officials and trustees about what a nonprofit should be as effective as a business would be is important. It's education. And I'm glad that my organization still has that going. So thank you so much. You've been a very good crowd today and had some very good questions. Do you have any more for any of us? And we're here to answer them. There are no stupid questions as far as I'm concerned. And
I did see some in the Q&A, and I'm going to float a couple of these.
okay.
One is, were there any tips on finding an alternative location, especially in small rural areas? And this goes directly to what Jan was just talking about. I think that a couple of things you can ask: who does similar work? Are there similar libraries, archives, museums, arts organizations around? Is there a group that you network with already? You know, in many cases, the state library or say an academic library group might meet for a whole lot of reasons. And this idea of disaster preparedness and recovery could be another area that you could meet on. So that can be a way to network with these groups and find an alternative location that does something close to what you do. I don't know if this was a alternative location situation, but I do know that the Yeager Art Center, I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, in Paducah helped after the Western Kentucky tornadoes, working with organizations in Mayfield, Kentucky, like the Ice House Gallery and some of the other groups there. And so that was a group that networked, and I think there was a possibility, if there was a need for any type of alternative location, that is something that could have been found in Paducah for those who went through the Mayfield tornadoes. Now, Jan or Elaina, are there other ideas that you have with alternative locations that you'd like to mention?
I've had experience with it's nice to have your cultural partners, but sometimes it's your downtown development people, or if there's an empty storefront and you've lost your gallery space for some unknown reason. And we've had success where, somebody doesn't want an empty window on Main Street kind of thing, and they help do put the exhibit there. And I think there's several kind of the cross using people outside of the arts is what I'm trying to say. That oftentimes get really excited about it, and you might have a kind of a different program, but they're helpful and they get excited about it. So don't just keep to your cultural buddies.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Elaina?
I would also say this speaks to the benefit of having some type of network in place, because you could just kind of work together, and often in disasters, different sites are affected to different levels. So if you have already established relationships with neighboring institutions or other entities in your region, maybe if they weren't hit by something, they could offer extra space for your institution and vice versa.
Great. We had another question that came in. How often should we have sort of the pre-crisis meetings, the idea of talking about this? I think that definitely yearly is good. However, with the way nature is changing and the pace of disasters is changing, you might want to do that more. And in some cases, this is the first time people at an organization may have talked at all about a disaster. I think putting that flag in the sand and getting that first one done and then saying, well, this is an interesting discussion. We need to develop a plan. How often should we continue meeting? And I would say 6 months to a year is important, just depending on how many disasters you might have had.
Also, it should be part of your onboarding process.
For sure.
New staff, no matter what. And I found that to be very helpful because you get a new staff person who may have some experience in crises and disasters that nobody had experienced in your organization or even thought about, yet it could be pertinent. So, and the way that we keep changing staff, rotation of staff, I think it's, something to may happen monthly, who knows? But
yeah, also I'd say if you have like a big construction project or any type of, any sort of site altering experience, it'd be helpful to have a sort of pre-meeting, because I feel like there's always things that go wrong during any type of alteration to a site.
Thank you. Our last question that we got in before Amanda put a good one in that we'll spend some time on in just a minute, but there was a question, what's a good estimated average for a reserve fund, or does it just depend on your organization or location? Anything that you have on that, Jan?
Operating, a year's operating. So if you give out money or you have special programming, I wouldn't necessarily with that, but you're going to need the rent, the payroll, all that basic stuff, and it's usually it can be 70% of your operating budget. It really depends on what you'd be willing to kind of let go for a year. But as a service organization, my local arts agency really felt, we wanted to keep those services going. So we voted for 100% of the operating budget that did not include our regranting.
Okay.
But anything is good. I mean,
yes, that's true. Elaina, anything else you wanted to add on reserves?
I agree. Yeah, I agree with what Jan said. It depends on organizational size and budget, but the more you can stash away, the better. I think there are countless examples of institutions having opportunities to get assistance from FEMA or other entities, but needing to front the money. And that's the part that can be detrimental. So having enough to be able to get through that initial period of time is really helpful.
Okay, good, thank you. The last question.
Before you do that, Brian Foote had a comment about local emergency preparedness committee can be a great resource and chance to network with governmental agencies. That came in on the chat. That was important too.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. One other question that came in on Q&A from Amanda Burden, would event cancellation policies help when a grant-funded event or exhibition is canceled due to a disaster? We've been asked to give grant money back when a flood shut us down. And that one was a pretty shocking question to me, because I know some places that have had exhibits, and one place that actually had a fire in their organization while a traveling exhibit was there. And, the main thing was that the organization said, we want to make sure that the exhibit is safe, but we will ship it out of there so it doesn't have to stay in an area where there is bad air, where there's soot, etc. So that was a good example I had. I think definitely I would look at when you talk with your insurance agent, the event cancellation policies, talk with them about the fact that an exhibit is a big event at your organization. It might be something that brings the most people of the year in the door as a special event. So see if that kind of thing can be covered, I would say, and ask about that. And Elaina or Jan, do you have any other suggestions for Amanda on this question?
Well, NCAPER, during the midst of COVID, actually did a white paper for funders to try to get them to be more understanding and to be more proactive in lightening or lessening their, well, we've always said you have to do, we funded a project, it has to be used for a project. And now many of them said, no, we'll allow you to do and use that for general operating, or will allow you to extend your grant period. It's very important to speak to all your funders to make sure, again, you're communicating that you're in this bind and what can you do as a team to figure out what to do. You don't want to give the money back. And I would say most funders don't want it back. So try to diplomatically give alternative solutions to giving the money back.
Elaina, anything else on that specific question?
I do not have anything else to add on that. I think you both covered it well.
All right, great. I think that takes care of what was in the other areas as in the chat as well. We have some reserve funds, okay, and the local emergency prep committee. Good. Well, with that in mind, a lot of good questions at the end of the session today. A lot of things based on our last few slides, so that was great. And as we said, we're going to look at networking quite a bit, and we're going to look at resources and resilience, and we'll have Leah Hamilton from University of Kentucky on here. We'll have the 4 horsemen or something like that that will be working on our session the next time. So with that, I think that we can close from our speakers part. We will see you September 12th and talk about resources then. And I will hand things back over to Kentucky Humanities Council for our closing.
Thanks to Jan, Tom, and Elaina for their insights, and to our sponsor, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and to the many individuals and organizations that shared photos and video footage, our sincere appreciation. We also want to thank you for joining us for this Disaster Preparedness online series session and encourage you to fill out our survey immediately following this event. If you're interested in reviewing the information covered in today's session, you'll be able to find a recording at kyhumanities.org or on our Kentucky Humanities YouTube channel. For Kentucky Humanities, I'm Bill Goodman.